Good morning. The committee will come to order. I know some are caught in traffic, but we'll go ahead and get started and think we'll be fine. The House Armed Services Committee meets this morning to receive testimony on the future of national defense and the U.S. military 10 years after 9/11. Perspectives from outside experts. As our nation marked the 10-year anniversary of the attacks on our nation this past Sunday, we remember and commemorate the lives lost on that day. We also honor the sacrifices made every day since then by our military and their families as our armed forces continue to fight for our nation's safety. This hearing is the second in our series of hearings to evaluate lessons learned since 9/11 and to apply those lessons to decisions we will soon be making about the future of our force. Last Thursday, we heard from former chairman and a vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Today, we will hear from outside experts representing several well-known and highly respected organizations to whom our committee regularly turns for accurate and reliable research and analysis. While we will continue to solicit the expertise of former and current senior military and civilian leaders within the Department of Defense, it's important to gain perspective from professionals such as these who make their living conducting the type of forward-looking strategic assessments that we seek. I remain concerned that our nation is slipping back into the false confidence of a September 10th mindset, believing our nation to be secure because the homeland has not been successfully attacked, believing that we can maintain a solid defense that is driven by budget choices, not strategic ones. As members of the Armed Services Committee, we must avoid the cart before the horse cliché. First, we must decide what we want our military to do, and only then evaluate savings within the department. To date, that hasn't happened. Over $500 billion has been cut from the DoD already. Nevertheless, if the Joint Select Committee does not succeed in developing and passing a cohesive deficit reduction plan, an additional $500 billion could be cut from our military automatically. On top of that looming concern, it remains to be seen whether or not additional cuts may be proposed by the administration, even if the Super Committee is successful. As chairman of the Armed Services Committee, I have two principal concerns that stem from recent military atrophy. The first is a security issue. In a networked and globalized world, the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean are no longer adequate to keep America safe. September 11th taught us that. The second is an economic concern. While it's true that our military power is derived from our economic power, we must realize that this relationship is symbiotic. Cuts to our nation's defense, either by eliminating programs or laying off soldiers, comes with an economic cost. The U.S. military is the modern era's greatest champion of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's time we focus our fiscal restraint on the driver of our debt instead of the protector of our prosperity. With that in mind, I look forward to a frank discussion today. Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the chairman for holding not just this hearing, but the series of hearings. I think it's one of the most important challenges that we face on the Armed Services Committee and certainly in our National Security Department of Defense strategy to figure out how we deal with the budget deficit we face, pending cuts. But also I think our experts today and everyone on the panel would agree that even if we weren't facing these budget cuts and deficit challenges, there's a need to review the strategy at DoD. A lot has changed in recent years. We are beginning to draw down in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have the emergence of all kinds of new weapons systems, potential challenges. Certainly a lot has changed since we had the fairly dependable Cold War strategy of being able to fight two major regional contingencies at the same time. So no matter our budget picture, it would be appropriate to have a strategic review. And it's important to point out that the executive branch, the President, is going through that strategic review right now, going back, looking at where we spend our money in the Department of Defense and saying, where can we find savings? Where should we spend it? What should our strategy be? I think that's one of the most important things that we're going to have to do in this committee. So I think it's great to hear from outside experts and, frankly, from many experts that we can get our hands on. It's going to be necessary. And it's important to point out that the size of some of the cuts that have been talked about on the Department of Defense budget would be devastating. I did not support the debt ceiling deal, despite the fact that I felt we should raise the debt ceiling, in large part because all of the cuts were dumped onto the non-entitlement portion of the spending, unless, of course, the super committee manages to do what we've been completely unable to do for the last 10 or 12 years and comes up with savings elsewhere. So it's all dumped on to the non-entitlement portion of the budget, and defense is over half of that non-entitlement spending. National security spending will be devastated if this plan goes forward, and we seriously need to come up with some alternatives to that. That said, we can clearly find savings in our national security spending. We can clearly find savings in the Department of Defense. Anybody who takes a passing look at the last 10 years can clearly find places where we need to spend money better, more effectively, and we could actually save money and be stronger. That doesn't necessarily have to work in the opposite direction. And the other point I would like to make is resources are part of a strategy. I'm sure absolutely everybody who's ever had to look at something where they want to spend money would like to say, let's imagine that money's not a factor. What do we want? I mean, that's the standard operating procedure for any program you can imagine. It's also completely unrealistic. You have to live within the resources that are available to you, and you have to figure out what your strategy should be. But the one thing that I absolutely believe is whatever we decide in terms of our strategy, we have to make sure we fund it. The one thing this committee, this Congress, the President, the Department of Defense cannot do is come up with a strategy and ask the men and women in our armed forces to carry it out and then not give them the resources to carry it out. So my personal opinion is you got to look at the resources in determining that strategy. Don't set a strategy imagining more resources than you're actually going to have. And the last point that I think is critical, we have to make choices here. And this committee can do a great job and has done a great job of pointing out where if you cut this, here's the implication. I think it's very important that we do that we make it clear the impact that these cuts will have on our ability to protect this nation. We need to make that argument. But if we feel very, very strongly that those proposed cuts are going to do irreparable harm to our national security strategy, that they should not be made, then we also have an obligation to come up with the money so that we don't make them. And whether that's finding cuts in other programs or finding more revenue, that's a critical piece of this. And again, everybody who's looking to spend money would like to say, well, this is my little piece. I can't worry about where it's coming from. That's your job. I just got to tell you that I have to have this. Well, if you have that focus, you're going to look up and not have that money if you're in the non-entitlement portion of the budget. Because the revenue is the revenue, the entitlements are the entitlements. They are what they are. It takes an act of Congress every year and the President to sign it to fund the Department of Defense. So if you don't deal with those other issues, as I have said repeatedly, you wind up being the person last in line at a buffet where the food is running out. It's not a good situation. So we have to talk also about what our revenue should be and what other programs we should cut. I look forward to this discussion. I think it's the most important thing we're doing right now because it will form our national security policy in the years and decades to follow. I thank the Chairman for having this hearing. Look forward to the witness's testimony.
Thank you very much. Now, as I mentioned before, we have special witnesses that have outside expertise, and I'm looking forward to hearing their testimonies. First, we'll hear from Mr. Jim Thomas, Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Dr. O'Hanlon is still caught in traffic. We'll move him to the end. We'll hear next from Mr. Thomas Donnelly, Resident Fellow and Director, Center for Defense Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and Mr. Max Boot, the Gene Kirkpatrick Senior Fellow for National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and then Dr. Michael O'Hanlon, Director of Research and Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. We all look forward to hearing your testimony. Mr. Thomas.
Chairman McKeon, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. And Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, I just want to underscore the importance of your opening comments this morning, that truly our national and economic security are intertwined, and it's not a question of one or the other, but it's a question of how we're going to manage both in the years ahead. And the second that I think you both stressed was that the cuts that would be anticipated by the sequestration trigger truly would be devastating. And this obviously is in the backs of all of our minds this morning. 10 years on from the 9/11 attacks, America finds its military forces still engaged in Iraq, Afghanistan, and conducting combat and non-combat operations around the world. But the United States does not have the luxury to focus only on the threat posed by Islamist extremists. Three challenges in particular will require greater attention over the next several decades: the rise of China, new regional nuclear powers, and the growing lethality and empowerment of other transnational non-state actors besides al-Qaeda. The security challenges we face in the decade ahead are greater than they have been at any time since the Cold War, while the resources to deal with them are tightening by the day. There is a need to revise our defense strategy in light of our changing security and fiscal circumstances. We have to make choices. Even if we didn't face a grim fiscal outlook, we would still need to make choices to address the range of security challenges this nation faces to maintain U.S. military staying power. A new strategy might call on allies and partners to do more for their own defense, with the United States serving as a global enabler rather than a first responder for every regional crisis that comes along. It might place greater emphasis on particular elements of the U.S. military to foster deterrence. Just as President Eisenhower's New Look strategy in the 1950s emphasized nuclear weapons to deter aggression, the United States today might emphasize special operations forces and global strike capabilities, including cyber capabilities, conventional and nuclear, to deter aggression and coercion. The United States and DoD in particular should also consider revising the force planning construct that directs how we size and shape our military forces, moving away from the preparations for conducting concurrent large-scale land combat campaigns focused specifically on conducting or repelling invasions. Instead, it might consider a wider range of contingencies, placing particular emphasis on one of the most stressing challenges our military faces, which might be the elimination of a hostile power's WMD capabilities. As we look ahead, we should assume that the United States would conduct no more than one large-scale land combat campaign at any given time. To deal with opportunistic aggression by a third party if the United States is engaged in war, the threat that the concurrency principle in our force planning construct historically has intended to address, the United States should maintain sufficient global strike capabilities, including a deep magazine of precision-guided weapons, to halt invading forces and conduct heavy punitive attacks over extended periods of time against any second mover. The United States should also consider revising its military roles and missions. It should reduce duplication across the services, including in combat aircraft, unmanned air vehicles, armored forces, and cyber capabilities. Beyond changes in its strategy and the design of forces, we should also look for greater savings and efficiencies in the institutional functions of the department, including reductions in headquarters staffs. We must also act to arrest personnel growth, cost growth, lest DoD follow the path of large American corporations that have run into trouble in recent years as their health care and pension costs have spiraled out of control, leaving them less competitive. We must also safeguard key elements of our defense industrial base as a source of strategic advantage. And today, the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments is releasing in advance to members of this committee copies of our new report on the defense industrial base. And finally, the Department of Defense should develop new operational concepts which serve a vital function as the connective tissue between our strategic objectives and the types of forces and capability investments that will be needed in the future. In closing, let me say that I believe, despite the conventional wisdom that America is in decline, the United States continues to enjoy unrivaled strategic advantages and the most favorable position relative to all the other great powers of the day. With ample political will and shared sacrifice, I am confident the United States can get its economic house back in order while continuing to safeguard the country from those who would harm us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Donnelly.
Thanks to you, Mr. Chairman, to the ranking member and the committee. I only lament that this hearing isn't being conducted in front of the supercommittee itself, the folks who really have the fate of the U.S. Armed Forces in their hands. So I hope you will make this result available to them and urge them to confront the issue directly themselves. I understand we're a last-minute substitute for former Secretaries of Defense. That gives me an opportunity to frame what I want to talk about and what I talk about in my written testimony. So I'm going to try to channel what I imagine Secretary Perry, William Perry, might have said. I had the good fortune to help him out and the other members of the Quadrennial Defense Review Independent Panel, very much a creation of this committee. So what I would like to do is try to address the strategic issues that you and the ranking member have raised and use the construct that we came up with in the panel as a way to think about what the consequences of these cuts, the ones that are already in prospect and the ones that, as Jim suggested, sequestration or a similar negotiated outcome would produce out of the super committee.
Without objection, your written testimonies will be included in the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And there were four, I mean, we in the panel, we very quickly came to a dead end once the members realized that the strategy enunciated in the QDR itself was really an empty vessel, not really a guide to planning for the department. And that was an observation that applied not only to the 2010 QDR, but increasingly to the QDR process since it had been initiated. The result was the members really kind of had to go back or thrust back on their own resources and their own experience. Fortunately, the 20 members were among the most intelligent and experienced public servants and former military officers that had ever served this country. And what we decided to do was essentially to deduce from the behavior of the United States, from what we have actually done in the world since the end of World War II, what our de facto strategy is. And the members of the panel very much came to the conclusion that we are not beginning with a blank sheet of paper, that there is no giant risk meter in the sky where we can perfectly calibrate the dangers and threats that Americans and American interests face in the world. And the best way to think about what we need to prepare for is to ask what outcome, what result the United States would like to see. What kind of world would we like to live in? And we very quickly came to these four conclusions. The number one priority for American strategy has been, remains, and certainly 10 years after 9/11, we are reminded that defense of the American homeland is the number one priority. We've made a lot of investments and been very lucky, and people have worked extraordinarily hard to ensure that those 9/11 attacks were not repeated. Certainly all of us who work in Washington, one of the questions we asked ourselves on 9/11, even before the day was out, was when's the next attack going to be? That's a normal response, and the fact that we've avoided that is a result of good luck, but a lot of effort, and a lot of effort on the part of the Department of Defense. It's obviously a multi-agency task, but DoD has contributed a lot to the fact that we believe ourselves to be safer today. The second enduring premise of American strategy is access to what is normally called the commons, the international commons. That's a term that was derived mostly in regard to naval and maritime power. That remains true. In a world, a globalized world that depends on international trade, not only does the United States, but the rest of the world and the most rapidly modernizing parts of the world depend upon the ability to ship goods easily, freely, and cheaply. Obviously, the oceans and the seas are an incredible and essential part of American power projection around the world, of our posture across the world, and in fact, our entire global position. The atmosphere, the air, the skies is also like the seas in being both an avenue for commerce, but an essential component of American military power. Indeed, American air power has been the signature form of American military power now really since the end of World War II. And even our naval forces are largely defined by their ability to employ air power, to be mobile platforms for strike aircraft or strike systems. But what is true on the seas and in the skies is also true in space, near-Earth space, and also in cyberspace now. And particularly when you come to cyberspace, we're spending a lot of money trying to figure out what cybersecurity really entails and means, and it's still a process of discovery. But it's also the case, reasoning backwards, that the failure to provide a secure environment for international commerce, which is more and more conducted across the Internet, and international communications, and all the elements of modern life that the Internet is intertwined with, if that's not a safe and secure realm for commerce and for military affairs, then there will be geopolitical implications. Imagine what a genuinely insecure or contested cyber realm would look like and what international politics would be like. People would, of course, turn first to the United States to say, where's the answer? Why isn't it safe for us to conduct our business? But then, if we were unable to provide such guarantees, again, I can't imagine in detail. I would defer to experts in this field, but it's certainly something worth thinking about and asking ourselves as we prepare to cut, and as the newest investments may well be the first ones to fall off the plate, what the consequences of that would be. Two other elements of our strategy are long enduring, and I think as we look forward, we have to ask ourselves, are we going to continue to conduct our business in this way or shape our strategy? The first is the balance of power across the Eurasian landmass, not to be too pedantic about it, in Europe, in the greater Middle East, and in East Asia. We have been in Europe for almost a century. The creation of a stable and peaceful Europe, which is a punctuation mark on 400 years of struggle and conflict, is the result of the American victory in World War II and in the Cold War. It's a human historic achievement. It costs us pennies compared to what it used to. The idea that we could somehow reap savings by withdrawing our garrisons in Europe, I think, is just actuarially or as an accounting matter not the case. But it's also the case that these positions are really useful lily pads for the projection of power elsewhere. There's not an operation that we've conducted in the Middle East over the past 2 decades that hasn't relied on either stopping for gas or, for example, returning casualties quickly to very high-end medical facilities in Germany. If we walk away from those commitments, it's not likely to immediately put the peace of Europe at risk, but it's certainly going to make our job more difficult elsewhere. We could not have conducted the operation in Libya, even as compromised as it was, absent access to European facilities and without our European allies. The same is true, even more so in East Asia. Jim referred in his testimony to the challenges that we face in that region. We have been withdrawing from East Asia for the last generation, particularly in Southeast Asia. And not surprisingly, that's the region where the Chinese have become more provocative and more aggressive in the recent years. And finally, in the Middle East, we're all weary of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and for good reasons, although our sacrifices at home are nothing compared to the sacrifices of those who are actually fighting the war, who are a very small proportion of our population. But again, if we step back from the headlines and look at the experience of the past 30 years, if I had been an investor in a penny stock called U.S. Central Command in 1979, I could have retired many times over, because the number of Americans in all services, in all capacities who are serving in that region has mushroomed, and we've been remarkably successful. Again, if you step back from the attacks of the day, in terms of creating a region that's more peaceful, more stable, and now, surprise, in the throes of its own democratic revolution. And finally, there's a component of American strategy that should not be undersold, and that's providing for the public good, the international common public good, whether it's humanitarian relief, even up to the more directly related to our national interest tasks of nation and state building and army building in particular. in states that are new allies of ours and who we wish to be our strategic partners for the future. Again, I'm simply trying to observe how we have acted, presidents of both parties, often who come into office saying, "I'll never do that again. I will control our appetite, and I will lift the burden and save money on war and on military expenses." To a man, they have reversed course and found that the need for energetic engagement across the world remains the core of American strategy. So as we contemplate these cuts, I think the benchmark ought to be what our past behavior has been. And you need to ask the supercommittee, and before we collectively as a nation make these decisions, ask which of these missions we're going to shortchange. The people who conduct them have been running at full speed for quite a while. And as we take away resources from them, their ability to succeed is going to be put at risk, and so are their lives. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Boot. Is your mic on?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Congressman Smith. Thank you, members of the committee. Thank you for convening this very important series of hearings. Thank you for inviting us to testify. And thank you above all for all you are doing to sound the clarion call about the devastating damage that would be done to our nation's defense and to our standing as a country if the full range of budget cuts currently contemplated in Washington were actually to be enacted. Jim's colleague, Todd Harrison, at CSBA has calculated that if you add in the cuts that have already been made and the cuts that are being contemplated, which, let us remember, is not only a devastating possibility of sequestration, but also the loss of the overseas contingency funding as we wind down in Iraq and Afghanistan. If you put all that together, according to Todd Harrison of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, the defense budget could decline by 31% over the next decade. That compares with cuts of 53% after the Korean War, 26% after the Vietnam War, and 34% after the end of the Cold War. Now some will say, good, it's a historical norm that we should wind down our military activities and spend the peace dividend when wars are over. In the first place, I would observe that it is more than curious that we are in a rush to spend a peace dividend when there is no peace, when our soldiers every day are still walking outside the wire in Iraq and Afghanistan, facing deadly danger, confronting our nation's enemies. They are not at peace. Our nation is not at peace, and yet we are rushing to wind down our military activities. Beyond that, however, I would put on my hat as not only a policy analyst, but first and foremost as a historian, and look at what has happened in the past when we have engaged in this activity of cutting defense after what we believe to be the end of hostilities, when we suddenly imagine that peace is dawning and we can afford to let down our guard. If there is one iron law of American history, it is that those cuts have made future wars more likely, and when those wars have come, they have made it much more likely that we would lose the first battles of those wars at great cost in blood and treasure to our nation. Let me just review that history very briefly with you, noting to begin with that after the American Revolution, our armed forces shrank from 35,000 men to just 10,000, which left us completely unprepared to deal with the Whiskey Rebellion, the quasi-war with France, the Barbary Wars, the War of 1812, all the conflicts of the early 19th century. After the Civil War, our armed forces shrank from more than 1 million men to just 50,000, which made it impossible to deal with the threat posed by the Ku Klux Klan and other violent terrorist groups seeking to subvert the aims of Reconstruction. After World War I, our armed forces shrank from 2.9 million men to 250,000 in 1928. That made World War II much more likely by emboldening aggressors in both Japan and Germany. After World War II, our armed forces shrank from 12 million men in 1945 to 1.4 million in 1950. The Army saw truly steep cuts from 8.3 million soldiers to 593,000. And those that remained were ill-trained, ill-equipped. We paid the cost in 1950 when North Korean tanks rumbled across the DMZ and the very first American force to confront them, Task Force Smith, was decimated because they had neither the training nor even the ammunition to stop this onslaught. After the Korean War, our armed forces once again declined from 3.6 million men in 1952 to 2.5 million in 1959. The Army lost almost half its active duty strength in those years. Instead, President Eisenhower thought he could rely on the new look, on nuclear deterrence, to prevent aggression in the future. That strategy was not vindicated in the case of Vietnam, where we confronted an enemy who could not be stopped by a handheld Davy Crockett nuclear launcher. After the Vietnam War, our armed forces shrank from 3.5 million personnel in 1969 to 2 million in 1979. This was the era, as you all remember, I am sure, the era of the hollow army, when we had inadequate equipment, discipline, training, and morale, all of which emboldened our enemies to aggression, whether it was the anti-American revolutions in Nicaragua and Iran or the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. We are still paying the price, by the way, in that the anti-American regime in Iran remains very firmly entrenched in power. And then after the end of the Cold War and the Persian Gulf War, our armed forces shrank from 2.1 million personnel in 1989 to 1.3 million in 1999. We are still suffering the consequences of that post-Cold War drawdown, which left us with inadequate force numbers to deal with contingencies such as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. As we know, our armed forces have been tremendously stressed over the last decade, and it's not only the Army, it's the Navy, it's the Air Force, all of which are running their equipment ragged, running their personnel ragged by maintaining an unsupportable operations tempo. This is the point when we should be recapitalizing our force, as called for by the Hadley-Perry Commission. This is when we should be building up to make up for the decline in overall American for the lost procurement decade of the 1990s, for the declining stocks of weapon systems and the aging of our tanks, aircraft, Navy ships, and others. It is certainly a time when, as has been pointed out by Tom just a minute ago, we are facing numerous threats around the world, which would certainly necessitate, if we were looking at things from a strategic perspective, a build-up, not a drawdown. When you look certainly at the fact that China is undergoing double-digit increases in its defense spending every year, that suggests the need for enhancing the American deterrent in the Pacific, not drawing it down. And yet, what are we already engaged in? We're already seeing the Department of Defense cut back program after program, whether it's the F-22 or the Future Combat System, the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle, so many over the last several years which have been canceled or cut back. So it is not as if the Department of Defense has been exempt from the budget-cutting acts. We're already cutting into what I believe to be the muscle of our military defense. The danger now, of course, is that if sequestration occurs, we will start chopping off entire limbs. Either way, our nation's defense will not remain whole if this budget-cutting imperative is allowed to run willy-nilly, out of control. Now, in conclusion, I would note that all that being said, if it were truly the case that the defense spending that we currently had were bankrupting the country, if the defense spending were truly responsible for the grievous state of our public finances, at that point, I might very well join the budget cutters and say we should cut back because, in fact, our nation's economic well-being is the ultimate line of defense and the ultimate guarantor of American strength. But as all of you know, that is not the case. Even now, even with defense spending having doubled in absolute terms over the last decade, we're still spending less than 5% of our gross domestic product on defense. It is still consuming less than 20% of the federal budget. These are both relatively low figures by historic standards. And it is impossible to argue with a straight face that defense is bankrupting our country. Clearly, as Congressman Smith mentioned, it is the entitlement problem that we have to grapple with. And even if we eliminated the defense budget tomorrow, we would still be left with a dire fiscal situation. But instead of dealing with our true fiscal woes, I fear we are being distracted by them. Again, as Congressman Smith noted, by the fact that it's relatively easy to go after defense and much harder to go after entitlements. And what this raises for me is the prospect of a dangerous world that I hope that I will not live to see, that I hope that none of us will live to see, which is a world in which America is no longer number one, a world in which our primacy is actively challenged, a world of competing power blocks, a Hobbesian world where the rule of law becomes a laughingstock, where our power is not respected. That will be a much dangerous world, and if history is any guide, we will pay a very high price if we allow the waning of our military power and we live to see a world such as that. And yet I fear that will be the inevitable consequence if sequestration occurs, and perhaps even if not. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. O'Hanlon, I already introduced you as Director of Research, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute. Sorry you were held up in traffic. We'll now hear from you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize, and I'll be brief. I was with a group of Army generals talking about a similar topic out in Fairfax, and that's a long ways with D.C. traffic. But my apologies and my appreciation for the opportunity. I'll just make a couple of brief points. I know some of what's already been said, having reviewed some of their writings. I think there are ways to do 350 to 400 billion or so in 10-year defense cuts, but not trillion-dollar cuts. And that's the bottom line for me. And I say this based on an ongoing research project that I've been conducting, where I try to begin with 5 or 6 what I consider irreducible requirements for American national security policy. And I think, for example, just to give you a highlight, we don't want to be in a position where we have to choose between protecting the Western Pacific as China rises in a promising but challenging way and protecting the Persian Gulf. We don't want to ask the Navy to make that choice. I think it would be fundamentally unwise. We don't want to ask the Army to choose between a potential capability to protect Korea, because as unlikely as war may be there, it's not impossible, and being able to conduct its ongoing stability efforts in the broader Middle Eastern region. We don't want to have to ask the defense industrial base to make a choice between keeping top-of-the-line excellence in certain technology areas like stealth, but not maintaining that excellence in other areas like submarines. And yet these are the kinds of choices I believe we're forced into if we make trillion-dollar 10-year cuts. If we make half-trillion-dollar 10-year cuts, it's still hard, it's still uncomfortable, but just to give you a quick sampling of the kinds of ideas that I think we can consider and that are difficult and risky, but still I think worth looking into at this kind of a moment in our nation's fiscal peril. I think we can consider a range of ideas that still allow us to maintain these core requirements, but that, frankly, are going to be tough. For example, consider a nuclear dyad instead of a triad. I'm open to that. Another idea that I think we should be open to, recognizing that unmanned drones now allow us to cut back the F-35 procurement buy from 2,500 to perhaps something that's only half to two-thirds as much, using drones and precision strike munitions instead of the number of manned tactical fighters that we previously anticipated. Another example of where I think we can be a little bit provocative, and we should be, is to ask the Navy to start considering rotating crews overseas by airplane and leaving the ships forward deployed for a longer period of time. The Navy has done this with minesweepers, and it has a variant on this for its ballistic missile submarines, but it does not do it with its surface combatants, even though I believe it could, and even though they've done experiments that show that it's doable. Now, you still have to have a ship back home for training, but when you go through the math, you can actually get 35–40% more utility per ship, at least in peacetime. This doesn't account for the need for a warfighting attrition reserve. But in peacetime, you can probably do better. That's the kind of uncomfortable idea I think the Navy has to consider. And I think the Army and Marine Corps are going to have to go back to Clinton-era, 1990s era levels in terms of size and overall manpower strength as the wars wind down in Afghanistan. So I'm open to these sorts of things. But even if you do these, and these are pretty aggressive and are going to make a lot of people uncomfortable and add some risk to our national security portfolio, I think you can get to 350 billion, 400 billion in 10-year cuts. You can't get anywhere close to $1 trillion. And if you go for $1 trillion, you're playing Russian roulette. Which interests do I take a risk on? Which capability do I forego? And I'll leave it at that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad you brought that up. In the Deficit Reduction Act, we have $350 billion, and that's what everybody is focused on. But It's actually, if you look at the numbers, if you go back to the Secretary when he went to the chiefs and asked them to cut $100 billion, find efficiencies, and you'll be able to keep that for more important things. When he went back to him, he said, actually, you'll get to keep $74 billion, and the 26 will be used for must-pay things that you'll have to continue with, so you won't keep the whole $100 billion. And then when he presented that to us, he said, and when we were going through that, we found another $78 billion in cuts that we'll institute at this point, which went against everything he had been saying for the last several years, that we needed to have a 1% increase going forward to maintain stability. And with the $78 billion, it reduced end strength by 47,000 in the year 2015 by out of the Army and the Marines. But he said we could go no further than that without significant cuts in end strength. Then the President gave a speech and said we want to cut another $400 billion out of defense. All of this has happened in the last year. And so the Joint Chiefs, I met with Admiral Mullen last week, are working on $465 billion cuts that have not been put into place yet, not the 350 that we're looking at. And if the Joint Committee is not successful in their operation, then we're looking at another $500 billion, which brings us up to the trillion that you just said is devastating. I thank you, each of you, for your comments and for giving us some ideas of things. I think all of us here understand that we had to make cuts, but I want to make sure that we understand that we're looking at $465 billion in cuts in the last year going forward for the next 10 years, which the chiefs have not yet given us what that really means. All we're looking at this point are numbers on a chalkboard. When we see how that translates down to program reduction, end strength reduction, we're going to have to deal with that. But that's already passed, and we're already grappling with that without getting any further into these cuts. You've provided us a lot of thought-provoking material, and I'm sure that these are things that we'll have to look at as we go forward. Could you please, each of you, comment on the likelihood that the United States would be able to reduce our military's commitments? In other words, all of these cuts have been thrown at us without any change in strategy. It's been just pick a number. I think we're going to have to look at what the commitment is. What do we expect our military to do? In light of the expected roles and missions of the military, please provide an assessment of the additional risk we assume in fulfilling these missions with a substantially reduced force, reductions to operation and maintenance budgets, and cuts to procurement. Mr. Thomas.
Well, I think as we look ahead, for as bad as our fiscal predicament may be, the predicaments that face many of our allies are perhaps as bad or even worse. I think it is it would be perilous if the United States were to reduce its security commitments around the world. We've maintained close ties with allies in Europe and in Northeast Asia for decades, and this really has been a source of peace across, as Tom was saying earlier, the Eurasian landmass, and that's not something we would want to walk away from. The real question is going to be how we reshape our commitments as we look ahead. How do we change the division of labor and the bargains that we struck in the post-war world after World War II and renovate and update them, bring them up to speed for the 21st century? For the longest time, our allies have been more or less protectorates of the United States. We have extended our nuclear umbrella and the cloak of our conventional and the cloak and shield of our conventional capabilities to protect those allies so that they could flourish as industrialized nations and prosper in reconstructing after World War II. But as we look ahead, we're going to have to recraft those bargains and expect more of our allies, especially in terms of their own defense. And here I think we can actually learn from some of the moves that some of our competitors have been making. If you look at what China has been doing over the past 15 years in terms of building up a robust anti-access area denial battle network that's really focused on preventing and constraining the power projection of options of others, it is possible that our allies could emulate China to some extent, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, where they can build up their own capabilities to hold at bay those who would do harm to them. They can better defend their own sovereignty more effectively than relying on the United States to project power into the theater to protect their sovereignty for them. So I think this is one of the things that we'll have to look at in the years ahead.
Just make one specific point, Mr. Chairman. And this is both an indication of where I think we can take a little more risk, but where we also have to be careful not to go too far. As this committee well knows, for 20 years we've been thinking about 2 major regional conflicts at a time as our planning metric. And in fact, for the last 10 years, we've been fighting 2 at a time as our reality. That raises the question of what should the planning framework be for the future. And as you know, the 2010 QDR essentially reaffirms the 2 as the number, and then it adds on other missions. In the old days, the other missions used to be thought of as lesser included cases to some extent, which was probably a misnomer. But I think at this point, we don't necessarily need to have the capability for 2 all-out simultaneous wars. And that by itself is a pretty risky proposition, to go from 2 to 1. But I think we can consider that with Saddam gone and with our other threats, our fiscal and debt threats. But if you're going to go to 1, you don't cut the force in half. You have to be able to sustain ongoing stabilization efforts in places in the broader Middle East in particular that may remain dangerous for quite some time. I'm not suggesting another big regime change operation, but if we even wind up putting 1 or 2 brigades in a future Yemen contingency, or heaven forbid Libya, or Syria, who knows where these things are headed, or Afghanistan for a longer period of time than some of us would now like, and you add those things to a 1-war capability, you still wind up with a need for probably 450,000 active duty soldiers and 160,000 active duty Marines. So even if you're prepared to be somewhat radical like that and go from 2 to 1 as your major regional war planning metric, it doesn't mean that you can do $1 trillion in 10-year cuts or that you can slash the force. If you're trying to be at all prudent, it means something much more modest than that.
It's always worse as far as you go down the line. There are more comments you want to make. I'll try to limit mine to 3 quickies. First of all, a matter of some facts. We have left the 2-war force planning construct 2 QDRs ago. The late Bush QDR had that 1-4-2-1, whatever that added up to, but it was a 1 major war planning construct. And the 2010 QDR had no force planning construct whatsoever. Secretary Gates said as much. And all the service chiefs complained loudly and long about that fact because they had no yardstick to measure their programs against. The other thing I would emphasize, actually 2 things, is that it's better for us to think of our global strategy as in a holistic way, not as a pile, an aggregated pile of commitments that we've picked up. It really is a system. The balance of power in the Middle East is critically important to the direction that East Asia will take, because East Asia depends critically on those natural resources and particularly energy resources that come out of the Persian Gulf and the region around there. And the world is just, a globalized world is a globalized world. And finally, Jim's point about changing the nature of our alliances is worth exploring in detail, particularly emphasizing new partners and new allies. The ones that we have won in Iraq and Afghanistan, it would be, I think, a strategic myopia to turn our backs on those people, but also trying to enlist new partners like the Indians, or revitalizing our East Asian alliances where there's been broad peace and stability that's allowed prosperity for the last generation, but which is now much more strategically up in the air than it has been at any time. And what that means for us and our programs is that we need to be able to really integrate this idea of building partnership capacity from the start. We should never, or only under extreme circumstances, build systems in the future that we can't share with our partners and our allies. And a program like F-35, for example, that was structured for exactly that purpose is now one of the strongest reasons for maintaining and recouping that investment is to be able to proliferate it among these new partnerships and alliances that we're trying to revitalize.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think you raised a very important issue about what is the American strategy going forward, and what concerns me, and I'm sure concerns all of you, is the lack of strategic thinking going along with the budget-cutting process. I see very little desire on the part of the administration or the American people in general to give up any of the major roles that our armed forces perform around the world. Instead, we're constantly having new missions thrown their way. For example, deposing Gaddafi in Libya, just to name one of many, or providing disaster relief after a tsunami in Japan. It's hard to imagine that we would forego those kinds of missions in the future. Instead, I think the far more likely scenario would be that we would still be trying to undertake pretty much all of the missions that we're currently doing, but we would just be doing them on a shoestring. We would be hollowing out the force in order to keep this aura of American power, but losing the reality of American power underneath. Some of the ideas which are actually presented for dramatically redefining the American posture around the world, I don't think stand up to much scrutiny. I mean, for example, I know just going out and talking to various audiences about budget cuts, you often hear questions raised about, well, why do we still have 80,000 personnel in Europe? I mean, what's the point of defending the Germans or the Italians? Why can't they defend themselves? But in fact, as I think we all know, the primary role of those forces is not anymore defending the Germans or Italians. It's simply a way that we can be forward deployed in the areas where our troops are most likely to see combat in the future. And the fact that we were able to shape events in Libya in recent months was due in no small part to the fact that we had those bases in Europe, that we can project power into the Middle East, into the Central Asia, into the zones of conflict in the future. And oh, by the way, it's not necessarily cheaper to bring troops home from Europe and to keep them at home, because the Europeans contribute to their maintenance in Europe in a way they would not do if they were based in Texas. So some of these ideas that might be thrown around out there for how we can safely contract our missions around the world, I don't think stand up to much scrutiny. And then you get into the really difficult trade-offs, the kind that Mike alluded to, about are we going to keep the Persian Gulf open, or are we going to deter China? I mean, those are truly nightmare choices that I couldn't imagine any administration really making, and saying, oh, we're going to give up the Middle East, or we're going to give up the Western Pacific. Of course, we're going to try to keep a hand everywhere, but the question is, will we have a credible capacity to back up those commitments? And unfortunately, I think if as Mike suggested, if we face $1 trillion in cuts, if we face the loss of 30% of our defense budget over the next decade, we're not going to have the capacity to back up our commitments, and then they will be exposed as hollow, and our power will become a shadow of itself.
Thank you, Ranking Member Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the interest of getting some other members in here, I just have a couple quick comments. I'm not going to ask a question. I think all of your comments have been very helpful to the panel, certainly to me, and I appreciate some of the insights. I just want to focus a little bit on the budget issue, because Mr. Boot pointed out defense is 20% of the budget, and went through a list of arguments as to why defense isn't the problem. Let me tell you, everywhere in the budget, every little piece of it, the people who advocate for that piece of it have an outstanding argument for why their piece of it isn't the problem. But it all adds up. So I take a very simple, straightforward approach to this. It's a math problem. It's a very simple math problem. If you are 20% of a budget that is 40% out of whack, you are part of the problem, by definition. If you're 5% of a budget that's 40% out of whack, you're part of the problem. Certainly the entitlements add up to 55%, so they get the largest share of it, but it depends on how you break those down. You know, Social Security is 12%, Medicare is 18%, and you can go through it. But I think what we've done collectively here is, you know, we defend our little corner of it. But the whole thing adds up to a big, huge problem. And I do appreciate Mr. Boot's phrase that it's hard to imagine that we make some of the choices that you laid out, and it is. But the thing that everyone's got to start to come to grips with is we are going to have to do a whole series of things that are unimaginable right now and have been unimaginable. That's what the numbers are in front of us. And instead, we spend all this time arguing about how, well, we can't possibly do this because it's unimaginable. We're 40% out of whack. we're going to have to do something that's unimaginable. Now, I don't want it to be too much in the defense area, but it's got to be part of the conversation. I would correct one thing that Mr. Booth said. He said that I had stated that the problem was entitlements. It wasn't actually what I said. I said that it's all there. What I said was, right now, the only portion of the budget that is being targeted for cuts is the non-entitlement portion of the budget. And when you take 38% of the budget, 38% of a budget is 40% out of whack, and you leave the other 62% out of the conversation, and I believe, as importantly, you leave revenue out of the conversation, revenue that has gone down as a percentage of GDP by almost 30% over the course of the last decade. And just to sort of close here with the unimaginable, if you take the overall position, primarily of the majority party, that defense cuts are going to be a big problem, and we've heard that, and I agree with that. Raising revenue is completely off the table. If you do that, you have to cut everything else in the budget by almost 50% to get to balance. Now, keep in mind, a chunk of entitlements is retirement pay for the military. People retire from the military. I don't think this committee would be too anxious about going out after that. So once you take that off the table, you're over 50%. If you accept that we have to get to balance, and I think, again, I think the majority party and I accept that we have to get to balance. So when we're talking unimaginable here, it's all unimaginable. We got to start making people aware of that and then make those choices. Now, I agree with the assessment here. I think defense can take a hit. Dr. O'Hanlon, I think, laid it out fairly well. Right now, it's taking too big a hit, and we got to bring some of these other folks onto the table. But let's not imagine that defense isn't part of the problem. It's 20% of a budget that's 40% out of whack. With that, I'll yield back. I look forward to the other questions.
Thank you. I'd like to point out to members that in addition to Mr. Thomas' testimony, CSBA has provided us with copies of the new report, Sustaining Critical Sectors of the U.S. Defense Industrial Base. We have copies for every member, but in particular, this is a report I hope our new panel on the defense industry, headed by Representative Schuster and Representative Larson, will dig into. Thank you for providing this information to the committee. Now, we will turn to the committee for questions. I will be enforcing the 5-minute rule so as we can get all of the members to have an opportunity to ask their questions. Mr. Bartlett.
Thank you. Our deficit is several $100 billion more than all the money we vote to spend. Roughly every 6 hours we have another $1 billion debt, and roughly every 12 hours we have another $1 billion trade deficit, thanks to our moving to this service-based economy. We were asking for cuts to be equal with spending, but these cuts are over a 10-year period, so the cuts are 1/10 of the deficit. The Ryan budget, which is a very tough budget, doesn't balance for 25 years. During which time the debt essentially doubles, and it balances then only if you make what I think are unrealistic assumptions about economic growth, 2.6% average. I think that will be very difficult. The world up against a ceiling of 84 million barrels of oil a day, which hasn't budged for 5 years now. So it's going to be very difficult to take defense off the table, and yet it is unthinkable that we would cut defense to the point that we're really affecting our national security. But we really cannot know what the sufficient support level is for defense until we've answered a number of questions. Are we going to continue to fight these discretionary wars? Hugely expensive, the most asymmetric wars in the history of the world. Some say that we're following Osama bin Laden's playbook, who wanted to engage us in endless, hugely asymmetric wars, which eventually bankrupt us. At the end of the day, will the benefit really justify the cost of these wars? We still have troops in more than 100 countries around the world. Do they really need to be there? After half a century now, we still have very large numbers of troops in South Korea and Germany. A number of people ask, why are we there? We have a huge decision to make relative to R&D and procurement. If we continue with all of our procurement items now, it will just suck all of the oxygen out of the budget and R&D is really going to be cut. How much R&D are we really going to need to protect ourselves in the future? We really need to answer a number of questions about the future military environment. The deep strike heavy bomber, will our stealth capabilities really run faster than detection and defenses? Are we developing a bomber that's not going to be survivable 20, 30 years from now? Should it be manned or unmanned? Carriers versus missiles. Clearly a missile is very expensive compared to one of our precision weapons. But the care and keeping of a carrier task force is just hugely costly. There's no place on Earth more than a half hour away from an intercontinental ballistic missile. There are a lot of places on Earth more than a half hour away from our planes on our carriers. What will be that balance? What should we do? Access denial and the expeditionary fighting vehicle or its follow-on. We really have the luxury of getting that close to shores in the future that we could use a vehicle like this? Should we really be developing a follow-on to us? How big should our Pentagon be? Dr. Parkinson noted that the smaller the British Navy got, the larger their Admiralty got, which is their equivalent of our Pentagon. Does it really need to be that big? We have 187 F-22s and B-2 bombers. Are they adequate to take out air defenses? Do we really need the 35 and the numbers that we're going to be procuring it? How do we get an answer to these questions so we really can determine the real needs of our military?
I'm happy to go first, if that was a question. Mr. Bartlett, you ask really a fraction of the questions that need to be and should be asked and answered. Unfortunately, the time is short. As everybody on the panel has observed, we have found ourselves unable to address these fundamental strategic and operational, budgetary and programmatic questions in a durable and lasting way since the end of the Cold War. The idea that we don't need to have a force planning construct is a recipe for further chaos. And finally, we also can reason backward from just the experience that we've had over the past 20 years, and particularly since 9/11. My summary analysis of that would be that the military that we went to war with after 9/11 was not particularly well prepared for the mission it got, yet it has adapted and performed quite remarkably. I wish the rest of our government were as adaptive and as mentally agile as people in uniform had been. And finally, I would say...
I'm going to ask if you could please respond to that for the record. Thank you very much. Mr. Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Thomas, on page 6 of your testimony, you note that the defense budget, including war costs, has gone from a little less than $400 billion in FY01 to around $700 billion in FY11 in constant dollars. You say that the buildup is markedly different from other defense buildups in the past because we didn't change end strength by very much, so it's not like you can let a lot of people go. And then you note that recapitalization and modernization plans for large parts of the forces are largely deferred. So the buildup didn't come from a lot of extra end strength, and it didn't come from a lot of modernization recapitalization. Since 2001, if you take us out to 2011, the defense budget is 76% higher than it was in 2001. And if you take away the OCO, if you take away the Iraq and Afghanistan spending, and you assume all that's gone, which I know you can't assume, but you take all that away, the core defense budget in constant dollars is 39% higher than it was in 2001. If we didn't spend it on end strength and we didn't spend it on modernization, where's the money? Anybody have any ideas on that?
The buildup that we've seen over the past decade really departs from military buildups we've seen in the past, in the sense that it really has been, in many ways, a ghost buildup. We have not seen increases in large numbers of forces in our active component of the military. We have not seen something like the Reagan buildup, where we went out and procured all kinds of new systems, with some notable exceptions like the MRAP, which has been deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Where has the money gone? In particular, one of the main leaders in terms of cost growth in the department has been personnel costs.
With all due respect, let's talk about that. Personnel costs went up by $39 billion, went up by 39%. So they account for $39 billion of this increase. So yes, they've gone up, but frankly, that's $39 billion of an increase that is $311 billion. So that accounts for a little bit more than 10% of it. Where's the rest?
I think it's a great question and a great way to phrase it and frame it. I think about 50 or 60 billion is in what I would call ending the procurement holiday. As you know, Congressman, we didn't spend much in the 1990s on buying equipment. We didn't need to at that point. But we've had to get back to spending roughly a quarter of the defense budget.
Actually, it's actually 27 billion of the 311.
Well, I think that I think it's a little more. I think in the 1990s we were averaging in the range of 45 to 50 billion a year on procurement, and we're now over 100.
Now, procurement was 77 billion in 2001. It's 104.
Well,
so
throughout
$27 billion.
77 in 2001.
Yep, it went from 77 to 101. So it's 27 billion out of the $311 billion increase.
Well, you have the advantage of a book in front of you that the overall 1990s average on procurement was 45 to 50 billion dollars, and I'm quite confident of that. We needed to get that number up by about 60 billion. And so I'm not really trying to disagree with you. I actually like this framing because I think it does point to where we need to look. Because the other point that I was going to get to, where I'm hopeful that we would be more in agreement, is that there have been a number of inefficiencies introduced. There have been some sloppy ways of spending money, and I think this builds on Jim's point as well. We have some of these things, frankly, have been part of the politics of a nation at war with an all-volunteer force. I think we've put too much money into retirement benefits.
I would ask Mr. Booth a question. That he talks about the 90,000 some troops in Europe and says that their mission really is not to defend the Europeans, to be forward to deployed to achieve other defense objectives. What defense objectives could not be achieved if that force were based on the continental United States instead of Europe? Tell me what specific objectives we could not achieve if we moved that force here.
Well, it would be very difficult to carry out operations, for example, as we recently did in Libya, if we were flying out of the continental United States, unless you were flying a B-2 from Missouri, which you can certainly do, but you're not going to be flying F-16s, F-15s, A-10s, and so forth. You're not going to be operating naval ships to blockade Libya out of Norfolk. You have to be forward deployed to do that.
So what if we got rid of all the bases that didn't have air capacity, then just kept the ones that have air capacity?
Well, you also have to have a point for Army troops, for example. Troops deploying to the Middle East often go through Germany, and troops that are evacuated, badly wounded troops who are evacuated from Iraq and Afghanistan, often go to a medical center in Germany, which is much closer to the theater of operations than would be if they were coming back to the United States. So there are huge benefits that we gain from having forward deployed bases.
I know my time's up. I'd be happy if the record could be supplemented by any of the witnesses.
I would appreciate that. Mr. Forbes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank each of you for your expertise and being willing to come and share with us today. I have enormous respect for each of you and for the members of this committee, but the ranking member said something that just took me back. He said that we had to make some unimaginable choices, and I agree with him on that, but I can't agree that passing an $800 billion stimulus package that didn't work was unimaginable if we hadn't have done that. I can't agree that it was unimaginable to not pass a health care agenda that's hurting our businesses and hurting our economy enormously. What is unimaginable is for us not to defend the United States of America. Unfortunately, that's what the business of this committee is about, regardless of everything else. And sometimes I feel like when we do that, we're in this rhetorical war of apples and oranges, and the public doesn't see what we're doing, because it's like being on a computer where I digitally zoom in to something with specificity, and I kind of miss the bigger picture. And if we could zoom out for just a moment, Mr. Donnelly, you mentioned 4 components that the independent panel had looked at: defending the homeland, access to our seas, air, and cyberspace, favorable balance of power across Eurasia, and also the common good. Tell me, if you would, for all 4 of you, how do we take away one of those components and not have a serious impact on the others? Because I hear a lot of that in the rhetoric. Let's just don't do anything in Asia. Let's just don't do anything in Europe. Let's forget dominating the seas and airspeed. How do those interconnect if we zoom back and look at that bigger picture?
That's a very fine question, and it would require more time and more analysis. Figuring out, for example, how China's rise will be affected by its ability to get resources from not only the Middle East, but Africa, but other parts outside of East Asia.
Then let me ask you to do this.
Is an important
Take
question.
that for the record, but let's drill in on China.
Okay.
Ms. Thomas, I know this is where you've been an expert. We're looking at an air-sea battle concept that we've been months trying to see and develop. Do we have the resources to do that now, forgetting all the cuts? And if not, what are these cuts going to look like in terms of us creating any kind of air-sea battle concept that we can deal with? And what are the implications to the defense of the country for that?
Thank you, Congressman, for your question. I think it really is terrific, because I think there's oftentimes a view that everything we talk about, and the reality we face is that in the international security environment, we're constantly going to be confronted with new challenges, with new threats that are out there. But we are not necessarily going to have additive resources to address all of them. So we are going to have to make some trades. What we have seen China building up over the last 15 years in terms of its anti-access and area denial capabilities, its submarines, its ballistic and cruise missiles, and other forms of precision weaponry, are only the first manifestation of what we're going to see in other places around the world, in the Persian Gulf, and even with non-state actors like Hezbollah, as they acquire some of these systems in the future. Across the board, whether you're talking about the Western Pacific or the Persian Gulf or other areas around the world, the operating environments in which our forces are going to fight are going to be far less permissive in the future than they have been in the past. And this is really what concepts like air-sea battle are driving at. How do we maintain our ability to project power transoceanically as a superpower to these areas where we have vital strategic interests, to defend allies, to ensure the free flow of critical resources to and from those areas? That's the real challenge at hand. But the concepts, I think, are really critical, providing the intellectual guidance that helps us connect the resources with those objectives. How are we going to accomplish these things? And in particular, in a world which is going to become increasingly less permissive, how do we think about rebalancing? Some of our forces that we have today, some of the capabilities we have today, really depend on very benign assumptions about the environments in which they're going to fight. They assume that we'll be able to use forward bases and operate from them. They assume that our satellite communications will not be attacked, or that our cyber networks will not be attacked. These are very fragile assumptions on which to base
What's the implications, any of you in the 50 seconds I've got left, on us not getting that right, just with the Pacific alone?
I would just remind committee members that 3 years ago, in 2008, RAND was already projecting that by 2020 we would not necessarily be able to prevail in a conflict with China over the Taiwan Strait. And that was before the unveiling of the J-20 stealth fighter. That was before China put a new aircraft carrier into the water. The balance is tilting very rapidly against us already in the Pacific, even without these major cuts. And that trend will be exacerbated with the cuts. And you have to think about, what does that mean for our allies? People talk about allies doing more. Well, if we have allies like Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan doing more, they may well decide that they need their own nuclear arms. They may well set off a nuclear arms race with China because they can no longer count on American protection. That is a much more dangerous world.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Davis.
Thank you, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here today and engaging in this discussion. Last week, when General Pace was here along with a panel, he testified that we really don't have a cohesive strategy, national security strategy. And he suggested we need something akin to an Interagency Goldwater-Nichols Act in order to have a coherent national strategy. national security apparatus which combines all elements of national power. I know, Mr. Donnelly, you mentioned that the military became very adaptive, but the rest of government has not. I wonder if you all could comment, beginning with Mr. O'Hanlon perhaps, but others, what importance do you place this issue in terms of our defense overall and in terms of the budget constraints that we're facing today?
Well, thanks, Congresswoman. Big question. I'll just maybe make one specific comment. On the issue of interagency collaboration, I'm sympathetic to the idea, but I'm not sure that's really the crux of it, because I think that the crux of it really is deciding where we have irreducible requirements overseas that we have to be prepared to help defend militarily. The State Department and other agencies are very important, but their costs are so much less as an order of magnitude, and their missions are fundamentally different, that I think if we're thinking about first principles on defense spending, this is an important conversation, but I would begin with key interests and threats. That's why I start with Korea, the Western Pacific, the Persian Gulf, and I don't want to go into detail on each one. I would also add South Asia and possible Indo-Pakistani problems. But let me just say one word on Korea, because it's come up a couple of times. I don't think the North Koreans are going to wake up tomorrow and decide, let's give it a shot, let's try to reunify the peninsula again. That's not the way the war is going to begin. That's not the scenario we have to worry about. What they might do, like they did last year, is some other kind of unprovoked cold-blooded aggression in which they killed 46 South Korean sailors out of the blue. They might also intensify their uranium enrichment program. They might start talking about selling fissile material to overseas groups. By the way, they've done some of that before, at least in terms of the technology, the underlying technology, if not the fissile material. They might, in other words, provoke crises in one way or another. What do we do in response? I'm not saying we dust off preemption doctrine and go after them, but I am suggesting that firmness and a demonstrated capability to handle any kind of a conflagration are important. And also looking at niche technological capabilities where we need to get better, not just hold the line, but get better. Missile defense, precision strike against their long-range artillery. And we also need to be able, if there is, heaven forbid, a war, to get some number of American ground forces there fast, because the South Koreans are going to need help in securing the perimeter of the country so the existing nuclear arsenal doesn't escape before we can prevent that from happening. The South Koreans can handle the longer-term occupation, assuming that reunification is the destination we'd be headed towards in this kind of a conflict. But they're going to need help at first to make sure these fissile materials don't get loose. And so a future Korean contingency, I think, needs to be part of our planning framework. And that's just one example of how I don't see an easy ability to discard certain interests or threats. I just think we have to be a lot more creative in protecting some of these more economically and innovatively, but I don't think there are too many that we can actually discard.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Booth, did you want to comment?
Well, I just wanted to add on the subject of interagency cooperation, which I am very much in favor of. I'm very much in favor of enhancing State Department and other civilian capacity to take on some of these tasks which have been given to the military. But we have to be realistic about it and understand that their capacities are as Mike suggested, an order of magnitude lower than those of the Department of Defense, and they could not possibly fill the gap of what the Department of Defense does. We're actually going to see a test of that, by the way, in Iraq, where currently there are about 46,000 U.S. troops. At the end of the year, their task is going to be performed by maybe 3,000 troops and 1,000 State Department personnel. I'm very concerned about that happening. But if you can imagine that writ large across the rest of the world, I don't think there's any way that the civilian branches of government can make up for what the U.S. military does, and not only in terms of fighting and deterring wars, but even in the engagement mission and the kind of military exercises, the kind of engagement that foreign area officers and others undertake, which are such a vital part of our diplomatic effort overall.
If I could be very quick, I would really be worried that in this budget environment that a lot of the progress that's been made over the past 10 years is likely to be lost. The State Department has not resolved, but I think has taken seriously the question of its larger development role, its role in kind of state building, if you will, just to use the shorthand terms. And also I would worry about losing the close integration that we've achieved between the intelligence community and the military, best epitomized by the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. As Jim kind of suggested in his initial statement, those kinds of capabilities are likely to be things that we will want to have in other situations in a very different environment in the future. And I think the temptation and the sort of the bureaucratic impulse will be for the departments to protect their core missions.
How would you want to see those issues framed, though, so that that doesn't happen? Because, it's one thing for the Defense Department to say, yeah, sure, we want the State Department funded, but it's another thing to find out ways in which they can economize in order to do that. So.
Well, as I said, this has not really been resolved over the past 10 years. A lot of the progress that has been made and has been paid for kind of in a year-by-year supplementally funded kind of way. There, AID, for example, has not been really refashioned into an appropriate or really powerful agency.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I also want to thank our colleagues on the other side. This really has been, again, a bipartisan hearing. In fact, I had to ask Congressman Forbes who had been invited by which party. And so that's the way it should be. Because indeed the primary function of the national government is national defense. And Mr. Donnelly, I appreciate very much you citing victory in the Cold War. Truly people seem to have forgotten how successful the American military was with our allies, the greatest spread of democracy and freedom in the history of the world, whether it be from Lithuania to Thailand, South Korea to Bulgaria. There are dozens of countries today free that have been under authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, and the people are blossoming, which is good for them and us, and it fulfills the dreams of President Reagan of peace through strength. With that, briefly, if possible, and it's been touched on, but for each one of you, beginning with Mr. Thomas what do you see as the biggest threats facing the U.S. today? What should the U.S. Military role be in deterring the threat, and how is our level of preparedness?
I think unlike the period after the Second World War, where the United States faced one major threat in terms of the Soviet Union and the expansion of Stalinist communism around the world, today we face a panoply of threats, but I would really pick on three. The first is the continued rise of China, and particularly the growth of its military capabilities that are of concern. China is not necessarily an enemy, but we have to be mindful of the capabilities that it's developing as those can challenge our own military and strategic position. The second is the rise of new nuclear powers. Countries like North Korea, as Michael discussed, Iran, and others that are emerging. If we think about land combat operations in the future, the greatest challenge we would face is conducting them in WMD environments. And the last really is we've seen with Al-Qaeda, and we've learned our lesson since 9/11 in terms of dealing with a non-state actor that can use great forms of violence almost like a state. We may face others in the future along these lines, and we need to be mindful. And I think this places a lot of emphasis on the need for a preventive aspect in our strategy of trying to prevent these small groups from emerging, working with others in the world, and building partner capacity so that countries can police themselves effectively within their borders and not permit them to become sanctuaries to groups like Al-Qaeda. Thanks.
Congressman, thank you for the question. I'll just add a brief word on Iran. And it's an interesting question and a reasonable question. What kind of a threat does Iran really pose? What would it want to do if it had more power and it saw us doing less, if it saw us retrenching? And, of course, this is a difficult question to answer, but I think we can look at a couple of things about Iran's recent behavior and speculate usefully. One, it would up the pressure on Israel even more through Hezbollah and Hamas. Two, it would try to create weak states to its west, as it's tried in Iraq for many years. And, of course, it had a war with Iraq, which may have left a legacy of mistrust there. But even when Iraq was being run by a Shia-majority government after the overthrow of Saddam, Iran was more interested in keeping Iraq weak. And even after it saw that whatever George Bush's early preemption doctrine might have implied, and might have made some Iranians worry that they could be next, by 05-06, it was obvious that they were not going to be next. This country was not about to embark on another preemptive campaign. And yet Iran kept up the arming of the Shia militias and even Sunni extremist forces to cause us casualties and to keep Iraq weak. So I think Iran would welcome a Middle East that it dominated by trying to push Israel at a minimum out of the West Bank area, but maybe even out of existence, and weakening as many Sunni majority and even Shia majority Arab states as it could. And that would be its preferred Middle East and the kind of threat we need to worry about.
Thank you.
I would just agree with what both Mike and Jim have said, but draw a little bit of a line underneath the question about China's future. Great power, or the rise of a great power within the context of a global system, is a somewhat unprecedented historical situation. We tend to think of China really as an East Asia power. It's already a global actor. And even if there's not a direct confrontation with China, I can imagine that there will be essentially proxy competitions, if not conflicts, in other theaters.
I don't think I have time to comment, but I basically agree with my colleagues.
Hey, thank all of you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Hanlon, you were sort of in the middle of your answer to Mr. Andrews a while ago, talking about the ghost buildup and talked about the sloppiness sort of factor in terms of where some of the money went. I'm not sure if you had a chance to finish your thought, and I want to just give you an opportunity to revisit that.
It's kind of you, Congressman, and maybe I use the word sloppy in a little bit of too quick of a way, because maybe the better word is just undisciplined. I think there were areas of military compensation, for example, where we said, listen, we're a nation at war, we have an all-volunteer force that we're asking to do really unreasonable things on behalf of the rest of us, and we're going to err on the side of providing more money than we may need in certain areas. I'm not talking about deployed troops and their families or survivors or injured. I'm talking about, you know, and again, I don't want to beat up on them too much, but sort of the mid-career retiree who goes on and maybe winds up, you know, in a job at Brookings or runs for Congress or has some other nice income, and they're not asked to pay even a basic normal health care premium, for example, or a retirement system that, as much as we do understand there's deferred compensation in the military, that why do we feel that it's okay to ask a young person, an enlisted person, to work for 5 or 10 years and serve the nation and go in harm's way, leave the military with no retirement whatsoever, but then give a very generous package to a retiring major or colonel. And there are ways to reform that system and also save some money in the process. These are the kinds of ideas that I think perhaps Congressman Andrews and I might agree in philosophy, that there are some needs to relook at some of the decisions we made in the last 10 to 20 years. And sometimes I think the politics of defense spending in a time of war lead us to do things that are not as efficient as they should be. That's the spirit of what I was trying to say. And I think several tens of billions a year in annual spending are involved in these kinds of things.
I mean, obviously another piece of maybe sloppiness factor is in procurement, and there's been another spate of stories just in the last couple months about, you know, embarrassing overpayments by the Army and others for parts that off the shelf, you know, would have been a fraction of what, I mean, is that just something that is just like the weather, we have to live with it? I mean, you know, if we're looking at ways to save money, it just seems like, you know, waste, fraud, and abuse, which is kind of a nice phrase and easy for everybody, but I mean, is it hopeless for us to ever sort of expect to have a system that actually really, you know, the taxpayer would feel total confidence is really working to get the best price?
I can just jump in on that. I think you're right to talk about the waste, fraud, and abuse and about the runaway procurement. We all know what's out there. What I don't know, and I don't think anybody has a great solution for, is how do you reform that so you can suddenly get more bang for your buck? And I think there are things you can certainly do at the margin, but I think it's unrealistic to expect that we can suddenly wave this magic wand and all of a sudden we can cut defense spending by 1/3, but still produce the same defense capacity that we were producing before. At the end of the day, we all decry the huge cost of weapon systems and the rising cost, but we don't know how to create that cutting-edge capacity at a much lower cost. And I don't think that's going to change in the next 6 months. It's not going to change in the next year. All that's going to change is we're going to cut back on the top line, and the systems will get canceled. They're not something that will start to be produced for a lot less.
One last shameless commercial for the QDR independent panel, which addressed this subject directly. I was convinced in listening to that discussion that the single most important thing we could do is procure things in a timely fashion. What's really been a killer over the last decade has been this protracted development period where the original technologies get overtaken by new technologies, and so bells and whistles are added and added and added, and requirements added and added and added, and things like the F-22 or the Future Combat Systems are systems are perfect examples of this. Whereas the previous generation, with the F-16 being the perfect example of something that was bought as a simple daylight fighter in large numbers and has been revised and modified to do a range of missions that was never anticipated, is a much better model. So a lot of the money that's gone down the rat hole has gone to changing our minds, deferring development, with the result that we get 187 F-22s for what we originally planned to get 750 aircraft for essentially the same amount of money.
Right. Thank you. Really quick, Mr. O'Hanlon, your recommendation about eliminating one leg of the triad, I mean, we've heard a lot of testimony about rising nuclear states. I mean, how does that sort of dovetail? Thank you.
No, it's a very good question. I think, Congressman, what I would do in terms of nuclear capability, I would not reduce our forces any faster than Russia reduces its. I would make sure that in this period of transition we stay well ahead of China, not so much because I anticipate a nuclear exchange, but I just don't want to give China the wrong kind of encouragement or wrong ideas about, being able to catch up and all of a sudden act the part. And I would make sure that our nuclear weapons are safe and reliable. That leads to a number of recommendations, but I think you can do that and still take potentially one leg out of the triad, or at least cut back systematically across a couple.
Thank you. I'd like to ask members of the panel if you could also watch the countdown clock, and when it reaches 0, try to conclude your answer as quickly as possible so that we don't have to rudely use the gavel here. Thank you very much. Mr. Runyon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, thank you for coming today. We've brought up the word adaptive many times. I have a few questions. I think they pertain more to our Guard Reserve component, which I think is very adaptive. And from speaking to the generals that I deal with in the Guard and Reserve, they tend to run a lot more efficiently and cheaper than our traditional forces. What do you see, and probably won't get to each of you, but what do you see the future of the Guard and Reserve as we move forward, and how we're implementing them in our fights as of now, and also from the components' ability from an equipment perspective pre 9/11 to now also. So, Mr. Donnelly, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. Really, the adaptability of the Guard and Reserve has surprised everybody who would have pretended to be an expert on 9/11. They've deployed more frequently, performed more competently, have non-deployment rates that are far below what anybody might have anticipated. That said, and they've become essentially an operational reserve. The distinction between the active force and the deploying Guard and Reserve force is much less than it used to be. That said, there's still a marginal cost associated with a mobilized Guard. When you use them, that's when the cost, arises. It's, again, much less than anybody imagined it would be. These guys have adapted and performed and been deployed over and over again and done yeoman work. I think we still are trying to understand what that may mean for future strategy making. It also means that they are not a genuinely strategic reserve. They're just on the conveyor belt at a slightly slower pace than the active force is.
If I could just add, I think as we look ahead, there may be some real changes that we can make and real opportunities as we think about broader changes in our roles and missions across the military in terms of how we use the reserve component. New missions that are out there, missions like cyber warfare, and thinking about operating unmanned air vehicles and other unmanned systems in the future. These may actually be very well suited for the use of Guard and Reserve forces in the future, especially given the synergies with some of their civilian occupations.
Just a brief note. I think it's always worth relooking, but I think that at a time when you're doing sustained operations, the economics of it are more or less a wash between the Guard and the active forces. If you're preparing for the one biggie that may or may not ever happen, then I think there's a little bit more of a shift towards the Guard being preferential in some ways or advantageous. But I think on balance, I feel pretty comfortable with the current mix. But just to back up, I think, Congressman, some of what you were driving at, that is a mix that now supports the Guard and Reserve more than we used to. And as we draw down from these conflicts, I think we have to remember that it took some effort to get them to where they are today, and we probably want to keep them there in terms of capability.
Mr. Booth? Well, thank you all very much. I yield back, Chairman.
Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to give Mr. Boot in particular one more chance to come up with constructive suggestions for defense cuts that could be made without endangering American strength. You may dismiss some of these ideas as marginal, but I think it's very important that every sector of our government make a good faith effort to root out waste, fraud, and abuse.
Well, Mr. Congressman, I think that the Defense Department actually has made a good faith effort, and as we saw in the last few years, Secretary Gates either canceled or reduced numerous acquisition programs. I mean, when you look at as well as closing headquarters like the U.S. Joint Forces Command, eliminating general officer slots, eliminating the Future Combat System, eliminating the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle, the VH-71 helicopter, the CGX cruiser, ending the buy of the F-22 and the C-17, ending the airborne laser, delaying the aircraft carrier, the F-35, littoral combat ships, reducing, announcing a reduction in Army and Marine end strength by 47,000 personnel. I don't think anybody can argue that the Defense Department has been exempt from cuts. In fact, the way I look at it, the Defense Department has already taken...
I didn't say that they had been exempt from cuts. I was asking you for constructive suggestions of what could be done going forward to trim waste from the defense budget without endangering American strength.
I think it would be very difficult to do, as I was trying to suggest. I think
so you have no suggestions?
I don't, because I think we've already cut defense considerably.
So the military budget is currently perfect?
No, nobody argues that the defense budget is currently perfect.
Well,
but the world
how it's imperfect.
No, the world is highly imperfect. There are a range of contingencies, Congressman, that we have to be prepared for, and I don't think that there are easy cuts to be made. My colleagues, Jim Thomas and Mike O'Hanlon, have suggested...
I didn't ask for easy cuts. I asked for any cuts. Is there any waste in the Pentagon budget, and if so, where is it? You're a defense expert.
I think that Secretary Gates went about as far as one could possibly go in responsibly cutting back defense programs over the last couple of years. I would not be comfortable advocating more defense program cuts, which I believe would imperil the security of the United States.
So any cut at all in the defense budget would imperil the security of the United States?
I suppose if you had a $5 cut in the defense budget, it would not imperil the security of the United States.
Can you help us identify any of those $5 cuts?
Well, we're already, Congressman, I don't know why I am necessary to identify cuts when we're already cutting roughly 400, this year alone, as the chairman noted, we're already this year cutting $465 billion from the defense budget. I don't know why there's a need for more defense cuts. I certainly don't see it from a budgetary perspective, and I definitely don't see it from a strategic perspective.
Mr. Boot, you're a defense expert, and you know that the GAO has identified the Pentagon budget for almost 2 decades now as one of the highest risk areas of all of federal spending, due largely to its unauditability, its untraceability. The Bowles-Simpson Commission, when they asked Secretary Gates whether they had 1 million defense contractors or privatized outsourcers or 10 million, they couldn't tell the difference. Well, the Defense Audit Agency itself was found guilty of not adhering to generally accepted accounting standards. So lots of times we literally don't know where the money is going.
Well,
is that defensible?
Congressman, you will find waste, fraud, and abuse across all sectors of government. But as was pointed out here before, I think that the Defense Department is actually the most important department of our government because it's the one that provides for the common defense. And I don't know any way that we can simply take out a line item for waste, fraud, and abuse and leave our military capacity intact. There are differences and certainly arguments that occur on the Hill all the time in terms of what's actually wasteful and abusive. And we see many instances when the Pentagon tries to eliminate programs, they all have their champions on the Hill, all of them arguing that these are not in fact pork barrel spending, but in fact vital programs. So I don't think there's any consensus about what constitutes the wasteful programs.
With your expertise, surely you could help advise us on locating areas of at least lower priority spending. Surely you could help us clean up the procurement process. Surely you could use your experience and wisdom to trim some of the excess.
Congressman, as I said before, I don't know how to usefully reform the procurement process to save money. Many of the procurement reforms we've had in the past have actually wound up adding costs rather than subtracting them. I don't think we have any consensus in this town about how to reform procurement, and so we can do more with less. And that is not going to. So we're not going to have a magical way to do that in the next year that will allow us to cut the defense budget without losing vital military capacity, something that Bob Gates, Leon Panetta, and other leaders have warned about.
Mm-hmm. I see that my time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I am disappointed that someone with such noted defense expertise would give up such an important task.
Thank you. Mr. Gibson.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the panelists for being here. I certainly have enjoyed reading your materials, research in the past, and I think without a doubt that everyone on the committee here wants to make sure that we protect our cherished way of life. I think that we diverge when we start to look at the specifics of that, and I guess I would challenge, in the main, the direction of the testimony this morning. I really think it comes down to an a priori question of what our role should be in protecting our cherished way of life vis-a-vis other countries in the world. Iran, North Korea, China, Venezuela, the list, we could go on, certainly of concern, but the question is what would a vibrant republic do in response to that? From my vantage point, from my experience and my research, if we continue on this path of assumptions, there isn't going to be any amount of increase that's successfully going to get it done. We're just not. We can find threats until the end of the earth, and we're not going to be able to address it. I think there's a fundamental question. I mean, look, what would be the point of having a military with the force, projection, and capability of the Roman legions if Rome no longer existed? So I think what we really need to do is have an a priori discussion about what it means to protect our cherished way of life in a manner consistent for a republic, and then do a QDR based on those assumptions. And I would maintain that where we would go first is looking at how we better neutralize the extremist threat. I think that you look at the intel community, we've had a threefold increase in our intelligence agencies and funding. And in my view, while we have incredible professionals in the intel community, we have a system that really confuses and really disappoints. And there are many examples. The Christmas Day bomber of 2009 is just one illustration. And then streamlining the intelligence community and then fusing it with operations in a manner that I saw tactically and to some degree operationally as the G3 of Multinational Division North during the surge. Highly effective and integrated joint special operations task forces working with conventional forces and local forces to neutralize the leadership of al-Qaeda. I don't see sort of a same global reach and response when I look at us neutralizing the al-Qaeda threat. And then beyond that, taking a look at the way we command and control forces, the way we lay down forces, the way we arrange our national security. So I'm concerned, as somebody who looks at this now broadly across the full spectrum of American life and looking at the priorities that we have, that if we continue on this line of thinking, we're just going to basically move until we burn out, until we don't have the funds to get done what we need to get done, and as we crumble as a republic. So I guess, challenging the direction of most of the testimony this morning, with all due respect to your incredible research and certainly your publications that stand behind, I'd be curious to your response to that.
Congressman, very eloquent and provocative and useful. Let me just say one thing, well, actually two. First, missions that I would not say we need to be ready for. You mentioned Venezuela. I don't see any need to provoke a fight there. Russia. Russia is still prickly and problematic, but I don't think it's a major role in our defense planning. I don't think it should be. I think the Bush administration handled the 2008 Georgia crisis more or less correctly, which was not to brandish our sword. I think we have to be willing to say that there are certain parts of the world where the risks are too high for the stakes, and we have to use the threat of economic sanctions or some other means of trying to defend our values and interests. And then finally, let me say just one brief word about where I think the strategy is working, because you imply that, and I think you're right, there is a danger that the price tag could keep going up. I think the strategy is basically working at current spending levels in regard to China. Now, Jim's right, others are right on the panel to say that we have to worry about Chinese capabilities, but the overall strategy, I think, is working. China is becoming an incredibly impressive superpower without using force, at least so far, to try to assert itself, and partly because we have been so firm and resolute in the Western Pacific and so capable, and working with our allies, which is a huge strength of our broader national security policy. So I think that's not a situation where the price has to keep going up, but I think we better be careful about cutting the price and the capability too much.
If I may, very quickly, I just don't see that it as being an unsustainable system. If you look at it as a slice, a proportion of GDP, of American wealth, the cost of American military power has diminished and diminished and diminished, but the extent of its effect has been absolutely global. We get an immense bargain, and even if you include the war cost, it's less than 5% of GDP. The numbers used by Mr. Andrews mostly reflect the expanded size of the American economy. We are wealthier, even allowing for the difficulties of the last couple of years. We can certainly afford to do what we've been doing for the foreseeable future, if we choose to.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, well, I appreciate the responses, and I guess we'll have to continue the dialogue going forward. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Hanavusa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Donnelly, can we kind of continue where you were? And I'm very curious, first, about the statement that you make in your second paragraph in your testimony, where you basically do not concur with Admiral Mullen's views that our deficit and debts are the greatest security challenges that we face. And you said you're worried about our future prosperity depending first and foremost on our future security. So it's kind of an open-ended question, but what exactly are you saying with that statement?
I'm saying that the global trading system, which is a source of our economic growth, but also the source of economic growth around the world, rests on a system of safety and security that is essentially provided by the United States. There are others who help, and that the costs of trade and the profits and the economic growth that accrue from trade would be put at risk if the seas, the internet, the skies, all those common areas, and the politics of international politics were more contentious, more riven with conflict, and that our prosperity would suffer from international political competition and the prospect of war.
I'm also very interested in the fact that your expertise is in China, and I represent Hawaii, and of course the Pacific is very important to me. I happen to believe that when you speak about the stability in the Pacific, I know one view of it is that the United States is providing the stability in the Pacific. The other view is that because the United States is providing a certain amount of stability in the Pacific, it permits China to do its economic growth, which is really in being the #1 trading partner, and that's something that we're not able to really compete in. So in that light, when you say about the United States' future prosperity, and we are doing this stability, or we're providing something that permits China to now do the economic stability and trades, do you see that at some point we're going to have to change our focus in the Pacific and become more active in one of those areas?
You make a critical point, and I think actually both are true. China's economic rise, its prosperity, would be unimaginable but for the stability and security of the regional trading system that is based on American military power. That's been a great thing for China. It's a great thing for humanity. Hundreds of millions of people who were in abject poverty are now prosperous, and it's been a benefit to the United States and indeed to the world. However, the direction of, as Jim and others have pointed out, the direction of China's military modernization is solely in a direction that would tend to upset or overthrow the security system now in place. And those are two paths, that's a collision course, and I don't think that's why I would say that the direction that China is taking is the most worrisome aspect that I see in the future.
Thank you. Mr. O'Hanlon, you said something very early in passing, and when you came in, you mentioned something that I'm very curious about, and you said something about 35 to 40% more utility on our naval. And I assume what you were getting at was sort of like keeping or utilizing our forces sort of like afloat. That's the way I refer to it. And if I'm mistaken, can you please explain what you meant when you said 35% more efficiency with the Navy, especially in the Pacific? Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. The basic idea here is that I think, as you appreciate, especially serving from where you do, whenever we send ships from harbor off to a distant region, we lose the time in transit. But on top of that, we also, the Navy enforces a very appropriate policy of no more than 6 months away from home station for any sailor, unless it's an extreme circumstance. And when you go through the math on all of that, plus allow the Navy to then shift crews from one station to another, after a 2 or 3 year billet, and then allow for ship repair, you wind up with a situation where the Navy needs about, on average, 5 ships to maintain one steady forward deployment in an overseas theater. If we home port more in places like Guam or even Hawaii, we'll improve the ratio somewhat. But largely this is because of the tyranny of distance. Whereas if you leave the ship overseas and you have adequate local maintenance capability in a port, Singapore or someplace else, you can actually leave the ship maybe for 12 to 18 months, and then you can rotate the crew by airplane. That means the crews have to share ships, both on the deployed end and on the training end. And it gets complicated. The Navy doesn't like it for that reason, that there are idiosyncrasies to any ship. They'd rather have one crew stay with the ship all the time. I think there are also, frankly, parochial, budgetary reasons why the Navy prefers not to do this. But that's what it boils down to. And if you do the rotation by by airplane, you can actually get 35% more capability, more days on station for a given number of ships in the fleet.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Hartzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to hear your thoughts about missile defense. I just had an opportunity a couple of weeks ago to travel to Israel, and while we were there, Hamas from the Gaza Strip was lobbing rockets in there, and it was encouraging to see their Iron Dome being successful in addressing that. And according to a 2010 edition of the annual report of the Director of National Security on Acquisition of Technology relating to weapons of mass destruction, it says Iran continues, quote, developing space launch vehicles which incorporate technology directly applicable to longer range missile systems. And it also said North Korea continues to pursue the development, production, and deployment of ballistic missiles with increasing range and sophistication, and continues to develop a mobile IRBM as well as a mobile solid propellant ballistic missile. So in view of the risks that growing ballistic missiles threats pose to the United States homeland, do you have concerns about budget cuts to missile defense, especially as it relates to the United States?
I think for all the reasons you just mentioned, ballistic missile defense as well as defense against even shorter range guided rockets and even artillery systems, as you talk about the Israeli case, these capabilities are only going to become more important as we look out ahead. One of the key challenges is thinking about how we change the cost exchange ratio between those sorts of systems and the sorts of defenses that we will develop and deploy in the future. One of the promising areas that we would want to protect among many R&D programs as we look ahead, no matter how austere our budget cuts, is going to be looking at directed energy weapon systems. This is potentially a game changer that's out there, not only for missile defense, but for countering swarming naval activity on the part of the Iranians, and in a host of other fields.
I would just add that this is not cheap. I mean, this is, as you rightly point out, this is a major threat that we face. I think the American people expect us to defend ourselves and our allies against the threat of missile attack, certainly the threat of WMD attack, but this is on top of all of the other expenses that we bear for defending numerous other vulnerabilities. This is just another vulnerability that we absolutely have to address, and dealing with some of the threats that Jim points out are absolutely accurate. The anti-access threats, the cyber weapons threats to our satellite capabilities, threats to our homeland from ballistic missile attacks and as well as from terrorist attacks. All of these are very real, and they're not going away. And what that suggests to me is the impossibility of massive cuts if we are going to deal with all these threats, real or possible, that we face in the next few years.
Mr. Donnelly.
Yeah, I would agree with both Max and Jim, particularly in the technology of directed energy. One of the unfortunate cuts of recent years was to the airborne laser program, which was not a perfect system in many ways, but I think was a critical program for exploring what direct energy would mean, not just in the missile defense role, but in the other roles that Jim suggests. I just think this problem is metastasizing in ways that we will find very difficult to catch up to simply by looking as an intercept question. You have to look, I think, at what would happen before launch and try to identify where the launches are likely to come from, and particularly when you're talking about China or other larger scenarios, what a longer war after an exchange, hopefully not of nuclear warheads, but of a big conventional barrage would mean. Would we be able to recover and to make sure that that was not a knockout blow, so to speak, that would take us out of the war?
Do you want to comment? Sure. Okay. Well, we just have 30 seconds, but even without cuts, how do you view our ability to defend ourselves in missile defense, like from a 1 to 10 scale? How, if 10 being that we're ready, we are able to protect and defend ourselves, where are we at today?
I'll start with a 5. I think we're pretty good against, I shouldn't say we're pretty good, we're getting better against low technology, small numbers of attack threats. We are not very good, and I'm not sure, frankly, that we would be all that good even if we increase the budget in the short term against decoys and other such sophisticated threats.
Okay.
If I could just quickly second the 5, I think that some of the key areas where we're going to have trouble as we look ahead are going to be in shorter range systems that our deployed forces are going to face in the field and many of our allies are going to face, as well as in terms of the intercontinental capabilities and longer range capabilities where we're going to see salvo attacks, which are going to place far greater premiums on our ability to do battle management and command and control to orchestrate our defenses.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank all of our witnesses today. I'm from Guam, representing Guam, and I'm following up on Representative Hanabusen's questions. And they're for you, Mr. Hanlon. In your remarks, you mentioned the dangers of drawing back our range of influence and power around the world. You phrased it as coming home from the world. Now, can you highlight some areas in the Pacific, and I'll throw in Asia as well, theater, where we could be more cost-effective in upholding our treaties and our alliances while maintaining our ability to project power? And along with that, do you think we presently have enough of a presence in the Pacific theater to prepare us for what our long-range national interests will likely be in the region?
Thanks, Congresswoman. A couple of things. On the latter question, I think the numbers are basically pretty good, but I think the capabilities have to keep getting better. And one area we have to worry about, and again, Jim and others have been alluding to this throughout the hearing and in their writings, is the threat to airfields from an increasingly precise capability with the Chinese missile force, whether ballistic or cruise. And that's not just confined to China, that's a trend in technology. So I think we have to worry about more hardened shelters for airplanes. We have to worry about buying aircraft like the F-35. Even though I would limit the buy, I would make sure we do purchase a number that are capable of operating off of degraded or short airfields. And I would make sure we have plenty of equipment to repair airfields as they're struck. And there are a lot of other things that need to be done as well. To your first question, capabilities where we could be more efficient, I think one area is putting more attack submarines home-ported in Guam. I think that's to the extent the good people of Guam are willing to host even more attack submarines, and I realize Guam's already getting a little full with a lot of military capability, but I think it would be actually a very good trade-off, because if one goes through the mathematics on that, and CBO's done some very nice work here, you see that being that close to some of the theaters that we want to watch, because after all, attack submarines are often used in the surveillance mode, that's actually hugely beneficial if you're carrying it out from a forward location like Guam, rather than having to waste all the time going back and forth to the good states of California and the like back on the continental 48.
Well, I don't know what you meant when you said Guam is getting full, but I do know we're not going to sink. I have one other question that I would like you to answer. currently one of the big parts of the budget is the military buildup ongoing in Guam. How do you feel about cutting anything from that?
I support the buildup on Guam because I think it generally is playing to our strengths of focusing on a key theater that's important, taking advantage of American territory that's more or less in a forward deployed location, but also a little bit removed from the immediate environs where China's short-term capabilities are becoming more threatening. And it also spreads our capabilities around in a wider array of places, which reduces our vulnerability to surprise attack, which is an area I think we have to worry more and more about in general. And so for all these reasons, I support expansion of airfields, also hardening of airfields, improvement of aircraft shelters, putting things underground like fuel capabilities so they're safer from attack, using airplanes that are capable of using degraded runways, putting more attack submarines on Guam, and if our good friends in Tokyo can work this out, actually completing the deal on moving some of the Marines to Okinawa as well.
Good. Does anybody else have any comments on that buildup?
Very briefly, I would support it. I'm worried about putting all our eggs in few baskets. In addition to creating...
Putting what, did you say?
Putting all our eggs in relatively few baskets in the theater, just to be frank.
But Guam is ours, too.
Yes, but it will be a target. It is a target. And it's easier for the Chinese to make the missile go farther than it is for us. I think we need to consider a more dispersed posture, a kind of week 2 or second day posture throughout the region, for which Guam would be critical, but not exactly in the same way that it's being considered now. I would like to be in more places.
Anybody else?
Well, I think Tom makes an important point, which is that...
I just have 28 seconds
Okay,
left.
well, just an important point, which is that we talk about duplication and streamlining the Department of Defense, and there may be budgetary reasons for doing that, but in terms of strategic reasons, you actually want to have some duplication. You want to have redundancy so that if God forbid the balloon goes up and war breaks out and you lose certain assets, you have others in place. And so what may seem wasteful in peacetime is actually absolutely necessary when the hostilities actually start.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Lungeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for your testimony. I apologize that I had come in later. We had Director Clapper and Director Petraeus before us on the Intelligence Committee, and I had to attend that meeting first. But in any event, I want to thank you for what you've had to say today, and some of the things I may ask may already be covered. But I've noticed that obviously since over the last 10 years, post 9/11, in addition to our greater reliance on Special Operations Forces, we also have a greater reliance and dependence now on cybersecurity, which is an area that I've spent a great deal of time on. So my question is, are we properly resourced in that area? And as we go forward and we look over the next decade, what areas in cyber do we need to be focused more on? Where should we be devoting our resources in that area so we're properly resourced? I give President Obama high marks in the way he's handling cyber. I'm not satisfied that we're where we need to be on the broader picture, and I think there needs to be greater authorities in the role of the cybersecurity coordinator. That should be a director's position, and strengths in that area. But where should we be most focused in cyber?
Last year, the United Kingdom conducted an exhaustive review of its defense programs, and it made substantial cuts across the board. What I think is instructive, however, is that there was really one area where they actually were increasing spending, and that was in the area of cyber, both in terms of cybersecurity as well as thinking about how to use non-kinetic systems as an adjunct or as a complement to kinetic forms of warfare as we look ahead. One of the real challenges is how we think about this problem. In our war games over the past couple years, everyone emphasizes cyber as a growth area where you want to make increased investments. The challenge is actually determining where and what sorts of investments do you want to make. Do you focus more on a strategic capability, both in terms of a strategic defense capability for a critical infrastructure in the United States, or potentially as a strategic offensive system weapon that you could use against your adversaries? Do you think of it as an adjunct or as a form of a means of suppressing enemy air defenses and going after other networks in the future? All of these things are going to have to be thought through. I would say that cyber will be incredibly attractive, especially as an offensive weapon for all of the great powers and non-state actors as well. And we would only not make investments in this area at our own peril. I think the second point that's really critical to keep in mind is that it's the intricate relationship between offensive and defensive cyber warfare. It will be very difficult to be good defensively if we do not think offensively as well, and vice versa.
I would just reiterate a point that I made in reply to the question that Mrs. Hartzler had earlier about missile defense, and that totally legitimate and appropriate to worry about ballistic missiles, totally legitimate and appropriate to worry about cyber attack. These are all areas where, unfortunately, our capabilities are deficient right now, and we need more spending, but we can't just, it's hard for, as we've been discussing, to see other areas of the budget or the defense budget where we can painlessly cut and give up other capabilities so that we can enhance these. And it's a zero-sum game right now, and it's hard to make the case for ignoring the looming threat on cyber or ballistic or other looming threats.
You know, I would point out too that obviously under President Obama's administration, we've created a new cyber command headed by General Alexander, which I think is an important coordination model for bringing the best of all the services together and properly using all the talents that we have among the various services, again, bringing them into a more coordinated model. Let me, as time is expiring, typically, and this does relate to cyber, I think, directly, but more broadly, additionally, typically when faced with budgetary pressures or downward trends in top-line spending, research and development programs are often among the first areas to experience reductions. From your perspective, what impacts, both short and long term, would a reduction in the current IDT&E accounts, particularly basic research, have on military capability?
Very quickly, I would just say that I would adjudge that our problem over the past couple of decades has been that we have not been able to actually produce what we have invented. So, and the distinction between what's R&D and procurement is a very fine line. We need to be able to produce things in quantities so that they're militarily important. And so what I would be concerned about is the balance both of basic science and defense research and development and the ability to produce large numbers of systems and capabilities in ways that will be important in the real world.
Very good. Thank the panel. I appreciate your time today and your patience and your thoughtful answers to our questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Langevin, and members of the panel. Thank you very much for your testimony. The committee stands in adjournment.